18 months in Zurich because of the COVID crisis. And last week I was in Moscow for the first time. That was my first actual engagement with actual people in 18 months. So I used to do 100 events a year and travel all over the place, including many ships. So I've done a few series of future events on cruise ships, and was a very interesting experience. I've been here 3 times to this event. And I have to say, in the last few years, there have been a lot of changes. A lot of change, not just the changes we're going to talk about, but generally speaking. Right? Technology now is at a place to where we can say that truly science fiction is becoming science fact. For some things. Some science fiction like self-driving cars. We're hoping, right? But it does seem a little bit like it's going to take longer than planned, even if you listen and pay attention to Elon. The thing about self-driving cars, just like self-driving ships, very similar discussion, right? In principle, it sounds pretty easy to sort of simulate a human. Right? But in reality, there's a lot of things that humans do that we don't know really how they do it. Right? For example, when I meet you, later maybe, even with a mask, it takes an average of 0.4 seconds to estimate the other person for a human, without saying a single word. I know, are you a threat, potential partner, whatever, right? 0.4 seconds. A computer can track my behavior on Google for 10 years, right? It would still think that I'm a 25-year-old woman who's trying to get pregnant, right? I mean, it's the most bizarre thing, right? Now the tracking, of course, is much better, but just to give you an idea of computer intelligence, my own name, Gerd, G-E-R-D, like gastrointestinal reflux disease, same thing. Right? My computer will just not learn my name, because it's not English, it's German, right? Maybe Dutch, but my setting is set to English. Right? So the computer refuses to recognize me as Gerd. I'm always nerd or turd or, whatever. Right? I'm never, because it doesn't know what Gerd is, except for the disease. Right? And it hasn't learned. Right? So as long as we're talking about autonomous anything, we have to keep in mind how complex that actually is. Right? However, when I get to Los Angeles to do a speech, or used to rather, I do rent a Tesla because I'm going to be jet-lagged. Chances are I can have a little nap while I'm in the traffic jam. Right? And it works fine for that. I'm very happy with that. So autonomous ships, ferries going from lonely islands, we can probably automate some of that. Right? So that's a whole debate about what's happening with technology. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 topics today. These are the 3 that I've pinpointed. And this has been a talk I've developed in the last 3 months. Really the major drivers of our society, of course, technology, right? Digitization, but that's not just digitization. It's like, I'll talk more about that. You guys are familiar with that. This is what's happening in shipping. It's what's happening in every single industry. The other one is decarbonization, basically going green. Right? And this has been again discussed, I don't know, 40 years. Right? But now we finally have a business case. We have the pressure. We have the experience of COVID saying if we don't react to emergencies fast enough, we're in trouble. Right? So decarbonization is becoming the major topic right after COVID, with COVID. And when I spoke here 3 years ago, I talked about it, and it was kind of like, dinner first, then everything else. Right? Bertolt Brecht once said, dinner first, then morals. And now decarbonization and going green is no longer a moral question. Right? It's operational. Right? It is the future. That's it. Full stop. And that means a lot for all of us in this room, but generally speaking for the world. Finally, Reformation. I'm not talking about Martin Luther here or so. Right? I'm talking about rebooting society for a different purpose. And that discussion has been raging as well, because in the COVID crisis we've learned that we cannot live well if not everybody lives well. Right? It all hangs together. Like, for example, inequality in the UK, but also in the US, has increased since the COVID crisis, right? Because of the polarization of funds. So, for example, all the tech companies have grown, exploded in value. I'll show you in a second. While many other companies have folded. So it's a real interesting scenario on the future of this business model. Let's start with this, however. Many of you may be on either side of this equation. You're worried about the future, or are you excited? I would say I'm mostly excited about the future, but I'm a futurist, right? So I get to look at it every day. When I speak to people around the world, it's really interesting to see that people in so-called developing countries, Brazil, India, Russia, where I was last week, they're actually quite excited about the future. In developed countries, especially in Europe, we're not. When the statistics, that's what they say. For example, France is the least excited. 8% of French people think the future will be better. Right? I don't know what French, why that is, but if you go to Chile or Argentina, 58%. Brazilians are the worst place for inequality, the worst trouble, 62% think the future will be better. China, same. So here's the important thing, especially in your business. When you focus on how bad everything looks, and there's a lot of that today, right? Then you develop this mindset of saying, oh, the future will likely not be good. Right? But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because when you think of everything as bad, you start, mistrusting, you start being more careful, you pull back, and you have this mechanism of creating the world you don't want. So the great saying by Barbara Hubbard, who was a leading futurist as well, said, as we see the future, so we act. As we act, so we become. It's very important to realize, what is the thing that we can get excited about? And where does it go? I think that's an overall principle of the future where we have to also understand that this future isn't coming linear. Again, I talked about that 3 years ago. Right? Hard to imagine. The future is leaping at us, and we're here. Right? We're not here. When you're leaping here, it doesn't matter. 0.01, 0.02, 0.04 is nothing. Right? 4, exponential leap, 8, 16, 32. And technology, as you know, is exponential. The progress of autonomous ships or carbon neutral ships, all that stuff looks like very little in the beginning here, right? You say basically it's useless, right? For a long time, like 3D printing, right? But now we're here, and we're truly leaping. I mean, a 3D printer can print a kneecap now. I can change my human genome, as was done in China 2 years ago, to not pass on a particular problem of genomics to my children, theoretically. So how long will it take until shipping and ports and maritime is completely revolutionized? Well, that depends on where you are on this curve, right? You have to make that judgment because it's not the same everywhere. So the car industry, I spoke at IAA a couple of days ago in Munich. Really interesting parallel to your business, right? The car industry, the biggest car show in the world, the IAA, now says that their show isn't about cars. Right? It's about mobility. So maybe your future isn't just entirely about ships and cargo and goods and logistics and trade. Right? Maybe there's a larger story. And technology makes it possible, but technology also takes away. Right? And I'm not here to tell you what exactly that will be. That's impossible. I mean, I would have to study a few more hours to do that. Just kidding. A few more years to do that. Right? But as I was saying earlier, you know the film, right? Blade Runner. Hear this thing, right? The flying taxi. Even better is, of course, the Schwarzenegger movie, Total Recall, where he goes into the Johnny cab. Right? This has actually become a reality now. Well, people are trialing it. Right? And you can safely say it's probably true that science fiction is becoming science fact in many ways. Not in every way. Right? But here's the principle of exponential change. The next 10 years will bring more change than the previous 100 years. And I'm not overdoing this. Right? This is not just for effect. Right? 10 years ago, we didn't have Spotify. We didn't really have WhatsApp. We were paying for phone calls. Can you imagine paying for phone calls? Right? No, over. So the world is different today. But 10 years from now, think about this for a second. 9 billion people on the internet. Today it's only 4.3 billion. Right? Entire power shift towards the east, of course, we already can see that. This sort of greening of energy, right? The invention of artificial intelligence, and on the story goes. Right? If you have kids, you got to think about that. Right? They're going to live in a world that is so fundamentally different that you have to ask the question, why should they get an MBA? Because they'll learn what used to work. Right? Will that work next year? Yeah. This brings up lots and lots of questions. So here is the Joby, right? The first functional vertical takeoff landing aircraft that's going to be used as a transportation mode in cities. Right? It's going into trial now. Same problem again. In principle, it looks like it could do the job, right? There are lots and lots of little fine-tuning things to be done here. But where exactly are we in the curve on this? You know, that is one of the key questions, of course, you have to ask. And so I believe that the shipping industry and maritime ports will be turned upside down. And that is good news. Right? Because there's many, many things that we can do much better. And it's not exactly an industry that's really hungry to like jump into the next hot thing, right? I'm sure you agree with me on this. But there are lots of parallels. Financial industry. Now we're talking about Bitcoin and digital money. It's not that bankers were per se interested in being digitized. Right? This just kind of happened along with everything. So here, 3 waves. The COVID wave, we're still in that. It's made a real mess out of things. You know, supply chain, people, provisions. And you know, first, of course, shipping companies cut back on their availability and their output. And then it turns out it wasn't enough. And now it's record numbers in terms of the cost per unit. Right? But here's the big thing. Forget about COVID for a second. That will eventually, in the next few years, become the new normal. Right? We're not going back to the world before COVID. I'll talk more about that later. We're just not. Is that a big deal? Probably not. Right? But the next wave is this. And there's going to be dramatic action on this on every possible front, from the users, from the customers, from the consumers, from the state, from everything, and after sort of a new economic logic, which goes, of course, with this one. You can't fight climate change if all you want is make more money. I mean, it's obvious, right? I mean, it will make money to decarbonize, lots of money. But to make a change like this has other reasons. You know, basically, you can't do business in a broken down world, and your shipping business will be stranded when everything goes to hell anyway, regardless of what you do outside of your sphere. Right? So that's basically what we're looking at, and this upside down world has a great comparison to the music business. I worked in the music business for 12 years. I was a musician and producer, and then I was involved with the first efforts in San Francisco to take digital music further. And I started a dozen companies. One of them was kind of like Spotify, but slightly too early. So instead of actually making it work, we lost $24 million. But anyway, this is the hard things that you learn when you do startups. Right? So you can see in this interesting graph here, the most interesting part is this, right? This. You know what that's called? This? The Valley of Death. Okay. This is when the music industry said, okay, we're going on the internet, but they didn't know what to do, so they refused to license in many ways, and then from their previous, this is US revenues, right? Only US. It was a huge dip because everybody was getting music for free. And there was no real way. And then Apple came and said, okay, $1 per song, right? What a stupid idea. Can you imagine? Like, I mean, if you like 10,000 songs, you're going to spend $10,000? Yeah, sure. I mean, totally like, okay, that was a stopgap measure, right? And now all of you around the world are doing this, right? 160 million people a month paying $10, 10 euros, 10 pounds, right? For what? 62 million songs. So the per unit cost is 0. But everybody pays, and many people don't even use it that much. They just pay. Right? So here's the lesson for shipping. You do not want this. And you're kind of like on the slope of where it's uncertain what the next step really entails, but The future of the industry is being invented as we go along, and we have to find out where to put our bets. What changes to make, and behavior also. Right? The music industry, that wouldn't have been possible without people having mobile phones like the iPhone, right? And the willingness to pay. Maybe that wasn't there before either. So it's all about timing. Right? Very important to realize what the sort of overlap is between those two things. Right? So I was saying earlier, don't expect this to happen. It's not going to happen. We're going into a wild decade of the most volatile, up and down, kind of, in a way, a golden era, like the 50s, after World War II, where a lot of things are becoming possible and other ones are crumbling. And consumer behavior has changed completely. If you're 25 years old now, in the COVID crisis, you've learned a lot of hard things, like not to expect anything to actually happen, right? Or that everything is always different than you thought, and that everything is being rediscussed and being looked at. So now we're going to a world that's like this. Many new normals in parallel. That makes your job a little bit harder, clearly. Because now you have to think about what exact fragment do I actually look at. But here's a summary of this. Business as usual is dead or dying. Okay? You are so lucky that your business isn't dead. It's thriving this year, of course, last year, right? For many reasons. But the way that we do business is changing fundamentally because all the circumstances changing fundamentally. Will people be printing 3D tennis shoes in the future? Absolutely. That means probably less shipping there, right? But maybe the substance to print them has to be shipped, right? So lots and lots of things that are happening, but we can't expect the future to be just an extension of today. Right? Look at the healthcare business. I know if you have any problems in healthcare, but if you're taking a statin, like for high cholesterol or blood pressure, right? That's treating the symptoms after you get sick. So you take that stuff forever just to keep it in check, right? Now what's happening is the healthcare business is saying, okay, we're going to look at all of your data all the time, and then we're going to prevent you having that problem with the statins, with cholesterol. Right? So we analyze and we predict, and that's called healthcare, not sick care, right? It's changed the entire model. And who does that business? Another good lesson from the music guys, the tech guys. Right? They're going to do healthcare. So as we see this happening here, right, we have to look for the horizon, basically scan and see what's happening, because many of the old stations will go dead. And they should. I mean, of course, you heard about the end of analog TV. Most people can't actually receive an analog signal anymore in most countries. It's all digital or cable now. So here's your new reality. Right? Many, many, many different channels. Digitization, of course, but also an entirely new consumer behavior, entirely new possibilities. It may sound like science fiction today to have an automated shipping system with an automated port with almost very few people, but we can only imagine the possibility of that and investigate it. Right? So that's definitely a growth area where we have to go. So when we look at what's happening now, hopefully a kind of rebound coming out of, I wouldn't say solving Corona, but dealing with it. Right? And that will happen only at that point where we provide vaccinations for everybody. Right? Africa, you know what the number is in Africa for vaccinations? Right? 0.3% on average. Yeah. So we can only say as long as we don't solve those problems, we will never solve all the problems for us. Right? But having said so, we're going in essentially this kind of shake-up mode. Right? Everything around us that is kind of normal is being reorganized. Right? And that has impact on consumption and on behaviors and vacation and tourism. So I say it's a kind of a strange golden age. Things become possible, others become impossible. But make no mistake about this, volatile, confusing, and considerable chaos. I mean, when you build ships and deploy them or build ports, it's a 10, 20, whatever time frame activity. It's not 2 years, right? Like retail or so. So it'll take a lot of intuition to figure out whether you should do this or should do that. Right? It's obviously subject to many changes. The Economist, 2 days ago, right? I don't know if you read the article, talks about the perfect storm for container shipping, price of shipping of the units going up like this. I'm sure you're quite familiar with that, right? That's not going to be the future. I mean, we all know that, of course. But this question is a really good one. The patterns of trade are changing. The patterns of consumption are changing. So I have to have a pretty wide filter to look at all the possibilities and to kind of investigate, and we can discuss it later in the Q&A section. So 3 basic points here. The COVID crisis has brought us big tech and big science. Right? Except for what used to happen in America, most people do actually believe in science again. That's a little bit different now. So basically, anything about technology and science, we invented a vaccine in 12 months. Right? Lots of trillions of euros or pounds are flowing in this direction. That's where all the success is. And for example, talking about crew welfare and so on, the possibility of actually communicating remotely, as you all have been doing. And I'm not talking about Zoom, I'm talking about essentially the possibility of virtually being there. Trillions are flowing into that as a development project. Right? So you can actually be in a virtual, like Second Life, remember Second Life, a long time ago? You can actually be in virtual reality. So there's lots of really good things. The second one is big green. Okay, again, I will talk more about that decarbonization in a second, but again, old topic, but now it's getting real. So that is these 2 things together. In fact, you need big tech to make big green, obviously. And here's the last one. Big state. No, just kidding. Big policy. I call it policy, it's better than state, right? But basically the government is now having a major role in everything, regardless of where you look. That can be terrible if the government isn't any good, as in some countries, right? But this clearly, I mean, the policy thing is big now, because now we have to make policy that may not be immediately understandable by everybody who would agree or not agree on this. Government is telling us what to do for travel, or how to wear a mask, and so on. We would never do those things voluntarily. So there's going to be a lot of new policies all over the place on all of these issues. And a lot more money. So that's one good thing, is this overlap, and this is what I would encourage you to figure out, how to create this triangle relationships between those things, because that's going to be crucial for the future. So I made a film in Lanzarote, as you can see. I make 1 film per year about the future. Lanzarote is a great place. The film is called The Good Future. And it talks about those 3 things. So big tech, big green, government, policy, and so on. It's at thegoodfuturefilm.com. But as I was preparing for this event, I asked myself, what is the good future of shipping? The best possible future. And what would that entail? So 3 points I mentioned earlier came to mind, digitization, decarbonization, and reformation. So I will address all 3 of those now. Let's start with digitization. So first, we've had more digital transformation in the past 18 months than in the previous 5 years. Like basically all the stuff that we looked at, like Zoom, like buying remotely, like e-commerce, like studying at home, working from home, they were all there before COVID. But COVID forced us to do it. Okay? My neighbor, 75-year-old guy, lives alone. He has a smartphone. He calls me, right? But that's all he did before COVID. And now he's on there buying Uber Eats, right? And getting his food delivered, because he learned how to do it. He had to. Right? I mean, the amount of activity has done, e-commerce and online learning and connectivity has exploded. And that has brought a huge change forward in technology. So there's lots of money going in development of this. And that has impact on what people do on ships, whether it's a cruise ship or trade ship or what they want to do. So connectivity is becoming kind of like air now. You don't want to be without air. Unfortunately, it's not quite as cheap, but, well, air isn't cheap either, really, in the end. But this is going to be an interesting discussion, because really what happens here is, as we connect everything, There's a great saying by futurist Alvin Toffler, who said, it is the framework of society that's changing, not the picture. And we have to remember this when it's about shipping and ports. It's not about the autonomous ship. It's not about robots loading off the containers. It's not just about that. It's the entire framework of everything around us that's changing at the same time. When we look at this together, for example, the idea of big data, right? Using data, all of you use data to analyze and make things faster. The cloud, the Internet of Things, quantum computing, that's a little bit further away in the future. Voice control, that's definitely coming, right? Going over here, intelligent machines, I'll talk more about that later. Blockchain for contracts, many of you looking at this. 3D printing, that is a threat to shipping now. I'll have a stat on that later as well. Virtual reality, which is, being in a digital twin, remote control, and so on. The last one is genetic engineering, which doesn't apply to you. But when you take all these things together, you have, in a way, the perfect storm, right? And a perfect solution. So really good exercise to say with the game changes, as I call these, is to look at those and say, okay, what is the likelihood of that impacting me when? And what is the return? What goes with the game changes, of course, is what I call the mega shifts in my book. I do have a couple of free copies, by the way, if you want one later. But this is the mega shifts, and chapter 3 of this book is available for free at megashifts.digital. Very important chapter. Basically what's happening is because of technology, all the societal things are happening, right? We can personalize offerings. We can virtualize controls of ships and cars and traffic and so on. We can cognify, which means systems are no longer so stupid. They're learning how to recognize things and to be smarter. And they're all constantly moving. So you take those two things together, that's kind of like the framework change that happens around us that we have to be familiar with. I want to pinpoint 4 things here, and it's about shipping. I talked about this many times before. In fact, I think 15 years ago, data is the new oil. That is an old hat now. Right? Now you can also say, well, data could also be plutonium, right? Because if it's not used, then it can be used as a weapon. Facebook, for example, is using data as a weapon. That's why I left Facebook as a platform years ago. And that can be used as a way of kind of doing things you're not supposed to do. The other one is more interesting. Artificial intelligence is the new electricity. So it's a system that figures out a pattern and says, hold on a minute, this isn't working. Or they can give me analytics and kind of like interesting predictions. They're not necessarily like a human would do it, but they're very useful. I'll talk more about that in a second as well. And then the cloud is the new office. Right? And the new living room, and the new car, and the new bathroom, and what have you. That's very interesting, but in the end, we're human. We're going to need to meet. That's what we're doing here. I always say Zoom is great, but hugs are greater. Right? But this is going to continue. We're going into a hybrid future. And if you're not 25, that is going to be a challenge. I mean, even if you're 25, it's going to be a challenge. Because you may get lost in this cloud. Right? I mean, imagine, I was just watching Mark Zuckerberg's presentation of the new virtual reality room called, I think it's called Work, or whatever, that Facebook is launching with the 3D glasses, right? And you can only imagine if this actually works, and I get used to it, and I work here at the NOC, using this thing, and then I come home in the evening, and I look at my kids and my wife, it's so boring, right? Because I don't have the glasses anymore. I'm no longer superhuman. It's like, I don't know, you probably have the same problem with a mobile phone already. You feel like something is missing when you don't have it, right? So for example, for that reason, I have one media-free day a week where I put it away. Right? And then I realize I don't miss it anymore after 10 hours, just kidding. But yeah, so that's one of those things that's going to be an interesting angle. And virtuality is the new senses. Right? We're going to see things like, Tom Cruise Minority Report, when he goes inside the data, he pulls it out, throws it over here. That's going to be our reality at control, for example. And that is coming much quicker than we thought. So the companies that do this, they're rolling, right? And they're going to produce so many cool things that you can use. Right? The chances that they will get into your business is extremely unlikely, but all of their tools will be there. Right? So that's going to be really, really powerful stuff, I think, for the very near future. So we have this kind of, I call this a meta-intelligence. Human intelligence talking to each other and operating a craft or doing things like this. You know, they involve all kinds of things, but here we have all the machine intelligence, you know, machine learning, the Internet of Things, the cloud. And here's the biggest one. Right? It's not AI in the sense of Hollywood or Black Mirror, right? It's IA, intelligent assistance. Okay, intelligent assistant means is not stupid. Okay? It means smart software, it can predict, it can analyze, it can do things, but it's far from real intelligence. And I'll show you an example in a minute from Google Maps, but it's quite clear that we can use this, but I think for the next 20 years we're going to always have the human in the loop. It's called HITL, right, in computer language, human in the loop. So we're going to use technology to do all kinds of interesting things, but we're always going to have the human in the loop, just for the same reason that we have a human pilot on the aircraft, even though in theory could work without one, in some instances at least. So human in the loop is going to be the ultimate principle, I think, also for autonomous ships and so on. And here we quite clearly see also what humans are good at cannot be defined with any of these terms. Emotional intelligence, what is that? Well, it means you have emotions, you can react to emotions, you can understand people, and basically it's all of those things that are kind of murky for us. Social intelligence and kinesthetic, that's the body. Computers don't do any of these. So for the foreseeable future, for at least 30 years, until we teach computers to be human, and that's what some people want to do, there's no way around us being replaced with this. Okay? Because you remember that computers for the time being are binary. So a computer can look at a trillion data feeds of weather or wave patterns, and it can find a way forward analyzing that, but it cannot make a decision that ignores all these patterns and makes up something else that is not proven. Humans do that all the time. We do things because we have lack of data, and we just do this. That's very important to remember when we think about the future. So by 2030, we're going to see exponential advances in AI, in deep learning, supercomputing, natural language processing. We'll be able to speak to the computer and say, give me the analysis of our path forward for the next 4 hours. We can do that now, but it's cumbersome. We'll speak to the computer like a person. Of course, then remember that it's not a person. That's the hard one. Right? So, to rival the logical capabilities. Alvin Toffler, I mentioned earlier, says the illiterate of the 21st century, that was 60 years ago, are not those that can't read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. That's your job. That's why you're here. Right? To unlearn. You know, it's the hardest thing to unlearn, because when you've been successful for a long time, you learn that what you've done is the right thing and just repeat it. Right? Turns out that that doesn't work. Right? Look at the German car industry. German car industry was known or is known for perfection. 7 years ago we had a big event with the German car industry with a bunch of my other futurist colleagues, and we said, you know what, the future isn't about making a better diesel engine that goes faster and takes less gas, right? There is no engine that is combustion engine in that future. It is electric, it is shared, it's autonomous, possibly. Right? And we said, you'll end up abandoning the diesel engine completely. That was 7 years ago. And we were basically laughed out of the room. Right? Now, every major car company has announced they're abandoning gas-driven engines, especially diesel. So 30,000 people have worked for 50 years to create the perfect diesel engine, and one day, no longer relevant. That's unlearning and relearning. So what did they do, Mercedes-Benz and Audi and BMW? They brought in young people from all over the world to invigorate their office and to come up with new ideas. And they invested billions in alternative scenarios. They collaborated. This is not just a problem for Germans, to think outside of that box, right? But it's a problem in general, especially when you are successful. So I think that's going to be the next big thing for the shipping industry to figure out how to take that leap. That brings me back to this, what I showed earlier. Right? Many people ask me about this and say, okay, so in this future, when machines are getting intelligent and they can do more things, it's going to be like this, right? Useless humans. You heard about useless humans before, from Harari and others, right? Basically saying that we don't need humans when machines can do all that stuff. And the reality is, some of our tasks, our routines, will be useless. But this is the principle of digital disruption. While anything that can be digitized and automated will be. I mean, in the beginning of the music business, we talked about how music goes to the cloud, and then we said, okay, movies to the cloud, right? Books to the cloud. Now it's money to the cloud. Transportation to the cloud. And this is true. Anything that can be, will be. But how you are seeing the world and how you're perceiving things around you, that's not something that can easily be digitized. Right? Did you know that the best possible camera, right, an actual really super expensive camera, can only perceive about 3% of the human eye in a picture? Right? And that is an amazing camera. What we see with our eyes is completely different because we don't just see with the eyes. Right? The memory is made by all things that we see. So really important that we realize what's happening here is, as we're moving into this future, anything that cannot be digitized becomes valuable. The end of routine, this is the kind of Lego setup of the port of the future, right? It's not the end of human work. If you work like a robot will take your job, right? Clearly. But who works like a robot? You guys don't work like robots. Part of what you do is a little bit robotic, maybe, like my work. I do a lot of checking and all these things, a little bit robotic, yeah? But we don't work like robots. But welding in a factory, doing simple checking and so on. Right, so that's basically what's going to happen here. Really important. Anything that cannot be digitized, and that's all the stuff that can't be digitized. Becomes much more valuable. This is why we're going to have crews, this is why we're going to have people, this is why we're going to have the human in the loop, because these things are impossible for machines, for the time being. Making ethical decisions. You heard about the trolley problem in the self-driving car, right? The car has to decide who to kill because there's an accident going to happen. The car has to decide whether it's going to kill the grandma or the kids or the teacher or, whoever, right? The trolley problem. So that's going to be sort of where things are going. And again, if you have kids, this is what they have to learn, right? Empathy, values, consciousness, imagination. Pretty much for any job. I don't know about you, but basically in 10 years, you can safely assume that pretty much any routine that is just kind of like, what's called dangerous, dull, or dumb, routines, basically just the 3Ds, right? Machines will do them. We're not going to be superfluous or useless because machines do those things. I mean, 100 years ago, 92% of the UK was working in agriculture. Right? Today it's less than 2%. Are we all unemployed? No. We found better things to do than to, push the plow. So this is what's going to happen also, I think, in your turf quite clearly. So here's a pyramid of work. That's going to be very important when we talk about crews and about welfare of the crew and so on. We're going to go away from this basic layer of intellectual knowledge and logic and data. Machines do that pretty well. It's good if we can do it, but do we have to do it? I mean, a lot of our jobs are currently sort of here, right? We know how to do things. But once machines get better, we're going to move up here. Huh? What's up here? Deeper knowledge. That is knowledge that you don't know that you know. That's called deeper knowledge. Right? It used to be in retail, what's called shop floor knowledge, or in the factory. You know how everything hangs together, but you couldn't explain it. You just know. It's the same on the ship, I would suppose. You just know how it all hangs together. without being able to explain it really. And understanding and tacit knowledge and wisdom, of course, purpose is the highest part of that pyramid. So I think that's where jobs will go in general, and in your business as well. Great quote here again from Albert Hubbard, Supreme Court judge, 70 years ago. "One machine can do the work of 50 ordinary men. No machine can do the work of one extraordinary man." And I think he meant women as well, but that was 70 years ago, right? So I'm not going to, just put a little extra letters there. But so to be extraordinary, that's our future. That's also why you're here, right? Because building that. This is going to be really important, I think, when we think about education. So one thing about artificial intelligence, you may have heard about GPT-3. This is a project by OpenAI, and it's called the Generative Pre-Trained Transformer. Now it's tech speak, right? But basically what it does is you produce an input by typing or speaking, and the machine builds stuff like a program or a code or an app based on your command. Right, so here's a thing you can see on YouTube. It's called Learn from Anyone. It's public code. Everybody can build this that knows a little bit of programming. And so you type in a question to Elon Musk, right? And the computer goes out and fetches all of the trillions of pieces of information about Elon and puts together an answer that Elon would have said. Right? And so you can learn, kind of, like you can ask Peter Drucker or Gandhi or JFK or, whatever information there is about people. And it's pretty interesting. But of course, you know what it does, the system, right? It goes through essentially a large armoire, a collection of cupboards. But not just 50, like 50 billion. Right? And it looks for the right drawer to pull, like you say, underwear or socks or whatever, right? So it pulls out the drawers, and then it throws it all together into the answer that is the most logical fitting. The machine has no idea what the question was, what a robot is, what a rocket is, what it feels like, none. Right? So it's useful, but not real. Eh? Great example here, Swiss couple was traveling to Rio de Janeiro. Older Swiss couple, and then they got there, and they were going to Parachi, which is a little bit north of Rio, a resort, and they were using Google Maps. It was 7 in the evening or so, and then Google said the shortest way is this way, and off they go, and they go through the worst favela in Rio de Janeiro, right? Because Google thinks it's the fastest way at this time of the day, to go through there. They get robbed and almost killed. Right? Flawless logic by Google saying it's the shortest way. Right? It may be the shortest way at 12 noon, but also not safe. But it's suicidal to go there after dark. Right? Google didn't know. Imagine that happens when you're navigating a 10,000 container ship. The logic of machines. So I think it's going to be very useful. Of course, Google can fix that, right? That's not so hard to fix. But it's machine logic. That's why I'm sort of for the, keeping humans in the loop. Now, this rather convoluted chart, you can download it later, but I just want to give you an overview of what's happening with jobs. So in the past, employees and jobs, and here in the future. So the future jobs are work in any time, use any device, create your own career ladder, focus on outputs, customized work. That's basically connected work like on a ship. Right? And that is the future of working. So there's new ways to work, new ways to collaborate, new skills, and also new incentives to join, which I think is urgently needed, right? To get people interested in the job again and to do something. So all that stuff is going to happen through connectivity, of course. And the other part is, this is something that is a big discussion right now because of the current COVID crisis, is the loneliness factor of not connecting with others. Right? Major issue that we have to look at. So let's talk about decarbonization, and then we're going to you can queue up some questions if you want to. So basically what's happening now, this is a Google time lapse about how we change the world. You got to watch it on YouTube, it's pretty amazing. Right? So this is what happened in Dubai, how we build things there. This is the Aral Sea. You see how that basically turned almost without water in less than 20 years. And this is how we changed the fields in Bolivia, and so on and so on. We had dramatic impact on nature, especially the last 20 years. You know, if you see the climate change panel explanations, it's basically like kind of going along a little bit like this for a long time, and then since the sort of the 60s and so, it's basically like this. Right? So I think it's safe to say when we're looking at statistics like this, we have created more biomass, asphalt, concrete, and stuff, than the entire biomass of the planet. Right? In 2020, we've reached a point where we created more stuff than what was already there. And you see exponentially going, basically, we're going to need 3 or 4 times the Earth to put all the stuff that we create. I mean, the stats are pretty convincing. This is actually the worst. I don't want to spoil your day because you've heard many of these things, right? But look at this map saying the worst possibility of climate change, global warming, basically leaves pretty much most of these segments here uninhabitable. That's 30, 40 years away. And when the climate change panel says that, it's usually 20 years. We're talking about your kids here, if you're my age, or the kids of your kids. And these numbers are even worse, you know, if you want to sort of, you know, have bad ideas about the future. Look at this number, right? We have already done all the damage in Europe and the US. And now it's the likes of China and India that are pulling even. Yeah. So all these facts are kind of showing in one direction. The bottom line is really this. We're at a fork in the road. We're basically at that place where we can say, okay, clearly, we may have 10 years to fix this, if we're lucky. And not just to not burn carbon any longer or change that, but also take it back out. Big project. And interestingly enough, we have all the tech. It's very expensive. We are at that moment where we have to make dramatic decisions, and really you can see what's happening. Not a big surprise here for any of you, I'm sure. COVID-19 is a test run for climate change. A test run in the sense of saying we had to do urgent, extreme things, and we're still doing that, because it's existential. It's life or death. And COVID actually is life or death, but it's not like 500 million life or death, like we're talking about climate change. So, and this is why the entire population and governments around the world are looking at this and saying we've got to really go to dramatic effects. So there's a discussion about a carbon coin, which means that you would, the rich countries burning more carbon would put money into a box, and then the poor countries who are not yet burning carbon, they would get the money not to burn it. We're talking about a very large story here. Right? So this has great impact on shipping because of this. We're going to see carbon taxes everywhere. And even with governments that would never talk about it. And this is clearly going to be one of the key solutions. So carbon tax for flying, that is coming, mandatory. Carbon tax for eating meat. I mean, I eat meat, I'm not a vegetarian. But hey, you know, we get very cheap meat and it doesn't work, right? So, I mean, it's, yeah. Is that bad news? No. Because when we have the carbon tax like this, if it's used correctly, we are raising trillions. And how can we use that money? To come up with sustainable fuel, to figure out how to do things differently, to work on global negotiation about how we can reach it together, how we can get China and India to come along, right? So that's what's happening. So the unthinkable is the new normal. Don't think for a minute we're going to sit here in 5 years and want to talk about the same thing. No. Basically, every company, every industry that doesn't address this issue is going to get hammered. In fact, some people are saying in 10 years, if you invest in oil or gas, it'll be like a criminal activity. Well, some people are saying that now, right? But so this is the new normal. Unthinkable. So your job is to say, okay, I have today, I operate today, I have to make money today and go on at one level, and on the other level is to think about the unthinkable, new possibilities at the same time. And if I look back to 3 years when I was here the first time, we have a lot of action now, right, in this area. And some of it may be a little bit like greenwashing, yeah, okay, great. That's the first stage of actually doing something, right? But this is where we're going. The end of oil and gas and coal. I mean, coal is already ending. And of course, many countries are now hard-pressed to go back into coal because of COVID, right? Like Germany. You know, supposedly the green country, and now we're going back to using coal. Yeah, it's a big story. We have the tech. We have to spend the money. And this is one of the key points. And how do we do that? I mean, basically, I said earlier, all of the great examples here from the IMO, and they say if no action is taken, the emissions from shipping and ports will actually grow to be more than almost 17%. Today it's about 3%. Yeah. So, and then we put all the stuff that we see about every day in the newspaper, like Hurtigruten makes an investment in batteries and biofuel, and Maersk, of course, with the carbon neutral methanol, and on and on. I mean, I screened this for a couple of days. I found hundreds of examples. Big changes compared to 3 years ago. 3 years from now, this will be the only example that everybody will talk about. Digitization, decarbonization. So that is the place where we need to put our money. And so the tide is coming in with this. You know, now you see all the green companies here, their share price is exploding. Anything green, invest in that. Right? It's like electric vehicles, fuel cells, solar. You know, that's where the money is. And ESGs, right? Environmental, social, and governmental investments, right? Exploding. So any company that has a component there will do well. Of course, the challenge really is this, right? It's the fig leaf problem. Right? Because we know that, you know, investing in ESGs is only marginally better than not investing in ESG, but I still think it's better. What we need to do is we need to put our money into the primary markets when companies go public to support them with the new ideas. Anyway, so now it's no longer about this idea of that being sort of, you know, Green Party politics or whatever you want to call it. But that's all finished since the COVID crisis. It's the business plan now. It's our survival plan. And I can guarantee you any amount of money will be made available to solve this problem. Any. I mean, we printed $34 trillion worth of money in the COVID crisis. Do you see inflation? No, not really. Concerns, yes. And why is that? Because it's solving a real problem. Right? If we hadn't solved the problem, it would be much, 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 much worse. Italy is going to get 274 billion euros. Right? A country to where everybody has sworn, all the other European countries, they would never give Italy free money. Rules are broken. And they should have it, in my view. Anyway, different story. So this is our business plan now, and this also forces us to think about system change. Companies that are rewarded to do the wrong thing are still making a lot of money. And that goes for every sector of society. Led by Facebook, for example, the most successful digital stock in the last 5 years is the worst company on the planet as far as your data and privacy is concerned. Right? Facebook makes $110 million profit every single day, and it's completely unsupervised. So this model I mean, it's mad when you think about it, right? I mean, that's quite a bit of profit. So now we're moving to a future where all these things are coming together, and things are moving into the cloud, and everything is going in this way. And we could think of this in a larger story. It's not just digital transformation, tech, right? We're talking about societal transformation. People consume differently, they buy differently, they have different emphasis, they ask for different things. Why do you think around the world are women and young people going into government? Right? And older guys who hadn't done the job are kicked out. I'm not putting any names here now. Right? Well, that's because this is what's happening. Right? And so ultimately that leads to economic transformation, like what is the business model of what we want rather than what we can have. Good old Milton Friedman, you know, right, from the 70s, who kicked off the ultra-capitalist kind of concept, if everything is about money, right? He says, use its resources and engage in activities that will increase its profits. And that was the US and the global sort of paradigm for everything, basically. Turns out, worked well, kind of, for a while, until there was no more room at the top. Basically, everything was taken. And now we're getting here to sort of reformation. That's kind of the idea. We have to improve our economic thinking. We have to think beyond GDP. And that is the reason, of course, why the shipping industry will be asked to do it at pretty much at any cost to decarbonize, digitize, and create more value. Right? Because it's no longer going to be just about stock market performance or private money performance, that is. Right? And here is Mark Benioff from Salesforce, who talks about his view, he's the CEO of Salesforce, of where this is going.
We need a new capitalism. We need a capitalism that's more fair, more equitable, more sustainable capitalism. Capitalism that values not just all shareholders, but also all stakeholders. And if we can put those things together, I think it can be a new capitalism and be very exciting for everybody.
Quite interesting guy when he talks about this. You know, it's an interesting story, like what is sustainable capitalism? It's been talked about again for 20 years. The answer is not simple. No. But suffice to say, stock markets are changing and incentivizing companies who think beyond just a simple thing, like Unilever and Patagonia and many other examples. And I think in shipping, the first company that does have come up with a new paradigm will be good incentivized to actually take a step in this right direction. So this is what I call the new operating system, and I have it enlarged a little bit from People, Planet, Profit, which has been around for a long time. So people, planet, purpose, and prosperity. So it goes beyond this idea of revenues as the key driver to 4 different drivers. And again, that's been discussed for 30 years, but it's finally happening because people are saying, well, the COVID crisis, what good does it do me if I can't live how I want to live because everybody else around me is in crisis? What good does it do me to live in a world that's fundamentally broken or breaking? Rising tide floats all boats. But if there's no water and no tide, I don't need a boat. That's the business case that we're looking at right now. That's basically what's happening all around us. We're going to see giant, dramatic pivoting in the next 3 years on this idea of what we actually want with what we do. And that's basically, we are already seeing this all around us. New narratives. Narratives are important. Right? New priorities and new rules. Also in regulation. You can expect, as I said, dramatic carbon taxes. And there has been discussion for a long time. But I'll give you some examples, okay? The high-level tax symposium and the G20 has decided that we're finally going to ask big companies around the world to all pay at least 15% tax. In my country, Switzerland, this is not good, right? Because that's where they put their money. But hey, this has been discussed for 55 years, and see what their principle is here, right? People, planet, prosperity. That is a big change because that money is going to go straight into the pot of financing our future development. And that's going to be very interesting to see where this is going, and of course what's happening with Shell. Shell was forced by their own shareholders to come up with a decarbonized strategy. Right? It's in court. Right? So it's European Commission Green Deal, you've seen that, and of course what's happening with the vaccinations. Right? Can we expect to get paid to vaccinate? No. We're going to have to vaccinate everybody at all costs. That's like completely not free market, right? So these things are changing dramatically around us, leading us back to this paradigm. That has great impact on what you do because much in shipping and also in global trade in general was based on extraction. So mineral resources and oil and gas and coal and what you have. And that's still kind of working, kind of. Yeah? But here's a new business model pioneered by China and by America. That's the business model of creation. Okay? And that creation is digital. Creating value with companies that are based on data, analytics, not natural resources, ideas, concepts. So basically in this world, I think Winston Churchill once said the empire of the future will not be one of weapons and machinery, but of the mind. So now the biggest companies in the world, who are they? Well, they are the companies that do all these virtual things. Right? And that's where all the money is going to come from, is to create new ideas, to create new concepts. And I think we can learn a piece from that, from these companies. Shifting the model away from this nuts and bolts model into the creative model. And this is already happening in shipping. I can see that clearly also in ports. Right? We're moving away from this world that is like this. I think I used that also 3 years ago. I call it the ecosystem. So basically, everything is contained in your own sphere, and my way is the highway. Right? Microsoft 30 years ago. Right? And now, it turns out, this doesn't work when the market is already completely jammed from all sides, and everything has to change. Then this is the new model. Right? It's an ecosystem. That's what we're doing in shipping. This is why we're here. Collaborating to solve problems, collaborating to solve the business model, collaborating to improve, to come back better, right? And busting this idea of everybody's out there by themselves doing their own thing, or the top 8 or so. Right? This is now a larger story: global trade, right? Technology, regulation, right? Value, consumer changes. So the future of maritime logistics and ports is to go from the ecosystem to the ecosystem. To reinvent how that works together, to come up with new plans. Don't worry about the financial implications of this, because just like the music industry, the money is there. People are spending money, this is needed, it's required. It's not that people don't want to pay for music. They just didn't want to buy CDs anymore when the internet came along. But beware, in the record industry, it wasn't the record companies who figured this out. In fact, they're the ones who refused to figure it out. It was Apple and Spotify and Simfy and entrepreneurs. 22-year-old Swedish guy hacked the problem of music. Those are the kind of people you need to work with in the shipping business. Right? People who are looking to hack the problem, as they say in computer language, try to fix the problem. It's going to be about this. Right? Don't worry, for example, about global supply chain. It is always going to be about global collaboration. The COVID crisis has sort of made a setback for this. People isolating and changing supply chain and getting worried, but this is coming back. Right? Globalization is a fact. Multilateralism is a fact. The only way forward is to collaborate. So wrap this up by saying, okay, what do you do now? This is always a funny thing when you listen to futurists. People say, okay, been very interesting, but so what? Right? So I'd like you to take some precise things with you there. So, going back to the wall, you're going to need a different mindset to deal with this. Watching television and 10 stations on cable television is different than having 50,000 available at your command. A lot more decision making, a lot more selection, a lot more understanding required. How do you do that? Well, you don't do that by looking narrowly at your everyday job 150% of the time. Right? This is what has always depressed me about the car industry when I was working there. They were so good at zeroing in on all, and it's a long process to make an engine really good, right? But turns out the engine is not needed, right? So, too bad. Look in the wrong direction. Right? You need this, the future mindset. And it's actually simple. There's no magic sauce. There's no Nostradamus. Just paying attention. Reading books, right? If you haven't read Bill Gates' book about how to solve climate change, that's a great place to start. Another great book is a bit science fiction called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. Great book about all of the future trends. I have a book list on my website, Futurist Gerd, if you want to see it. But anyway, this is a skill, right? And it's just like, let's say you're really, you're not regular weight, you're overweight, and you've been struggling with it for years. At one point, you have to make a decision. Right? It's not something that's impossible, you just haven't really decided. Right? It may be hard, but it's not impossible. You have to make a decision. Right? And when you think about the future, making that a priority, this should be done 45 to 60 minutes per day. Bill Gates calls it the 5-hour rule, 5 hours a week. Learning stuff that's not already here. I guarantee you, in your company, if you do this and the others are still just operating, you'll come out winning. Taking a wider view. And that goes with this, right? Let's look at your business a little bit more holistically. Now, holistic means, okay, ports, containers, consumption, people, technology, trade, global trade, and all that stuff taken together. That's how we get to the future. When Daniel Ek invented Spotify, he didn't look and say, okay, there's 4 billion people on the internet, and if they all pay $10, I have 40 billion. Right? He said, no, it's like people have mobile phones, they love the internet, they're willing to spend, but not much. Right? So here's the answer. Right? Now, holistic, and God knows that was a big fight, of course, because everybody else had to come along. Right? Took 10 years. I think it's now worth $28 billion, euros. So, developing the future mindset. And very important is this. We talked about this today, like autonomous shipping and so on, right? You have to figure out if it's science fiction or already science fact. Whatever you're looking at. I can't answer that question for you because it's contextual. It depends on where and how you're looking, right? But if you miss the pivot point, you are in deep trouble. Missing the pivot point means, the car industry again, great example. Everybody says when you're here, oh yes, I'll come along. Well, good luck then. What is the pivot point? My view, there's some very clear pivot points. For example, alternative fuels, new ways of operating engines, digitization, efficiency. You talk about that all day, I'm sure, in this event. But that is the key question. What is the pivot point and when is it? To recognize how good it is. And as I said earlier, I think the clear pivot point today for the use case is, first of all, decarbonization. And it will make serious money when you do this. In the beginning, it will take money, obviously. It's kind of like digitizing media, same story. So, taking a wider view, right? Henry Miller, one of my favorite authors, he says, one's destination is never a place, but a new way of seeing things. I don't know if you've ever been to therapy with your husband or your wife or your kids, for that matter. When you go there, this is what the therapist does. Gives you a new way of seeing things. It was all there before, you just didn't see it. And this is so important about when we look at the future, like this animation shows, the music industry went from the record to the cloud. They didn't see it. Daniel did. Right? Car industry goes from owning a car to getting access. Banking goes from the building to the blockchain. This is what you have to see. This is why I guarantee you, if you see a little bit more of that, have a new way of seeing things, you're going to come out ahead with your company. And this company, for example, has, of course, being a technology company, developed a good view of looking at what that future could be, right? Where we are here now. So a new way of seeing things is really important, which way we go. So I'd summarize by saying what the action plan is. Digitization, I say, well, I wouldn't say it's boring, but it's here now, right? And it's working. Everybody's doing it. But, to quote my colleague Paul Sappho, who once said that we should not mistake a clear view with a short distance. So, when it's about autonomous vehicles and all the stuff that is coming, it is a clear view, but it's not a short distance. So we have to keep in mind to be realistic about what the view is and where we exactly can go. Like semi-autonomous things, I think that is the ticket, intelligent assistance, not magic AI. So this is here now and obviously crucial. And you guys are putting all your money there. The second part is this, right? Decarbonization is essential, is existential. It's a tough mission. It's scary. But vastly beneficial. If we can turn this around, imagine, right, for example, unlimited energy by using new ways of energy roughly in 10, 15 years becomes feasible. Not just with solar, but also next generation nuclear, for example. There's many, many stories. We just have to turn the money into a different direction. I don't know if you know this, but roughly $5.6 trillion every year are spent on fossil fuel subsidy. Okay, and that's probably not for ships. I'm not aware of that, but it is for people driving their cars. Indonesia, for example. Right? Imagine what would happen if we took that money and we said, we're going to fund all those countries with electric bikes and electric cars and building the infrastructure instead of paying them to pollute. Well, that's not going to be a popular discussion, obviously. But clearly, this is what's happening. You will be punished severely if you don't have a program for this. From your shareholders, from the users, from your customers. So that is a very, very serious topic. Lastly, the most important one is reformation. If the stock market says to you, whatever big shipping company or port organization you are, and the stock market says, what are you guys doing? Where's the dividend? Right? Because you didn't make enough money because you were putting money into all that green stuff. Yeah? Well, you're not going to, that's a problem. Right? So that is something we have to fix with policy. Now we have the first stock market in America called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, the LTSE. The first companies just went public there. And that's a stock market for companies who are looking for a long-term benefit of everything that they do. And that is a model that we're going to see in Europe, also in the UK, quite likely in the next decade. So altogether, that's kind of the mission of where things are going. I want to wrap up by one saying also again from Mark Benioff, who said that we need to get to the future ahead of your customers. Whoop, stay there. Get to the future ahead of your customers and be ready to greet them when they arrive. That's your job. And Salesforce is a great example for how successful that can be. Right? Always a little bit ahead, always leading a little bit, but not too far, right? And basically getting people to understand that they know the future. And this is what your customers want to know. No matter what part of the industry you're in, they want to know that you get where it's going and you can take them there. So that's it in a nutshell. I want to thank you very much. This is a long session. Now we're going to take some questions. If you have any questions, I think we're going to use the Slido thing, right? Yeah, and you have some, right? Well, thanks very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerd. Fascinating stuff. Guys, if you want to put any questions on Slido.com, and the code to get in is LISW21. There's one on here so far, so we'll start with that while you think it up. Slido.com, LISW21. Gerd, the first question that came in, if you could pick one challenge to solve in maritime, what would it be, why and how would you solve it? There's a $1 billion question for you.
Well, I think right now, time frame wise, I would say the complete digitization of everything in maritime. That is the current challenge, right? But it seems to me that this is on the way, right? The real big challenge is the entire business model of how things are being done and the paradigms from the past that have worked so well to change those. That is the big challenge. Of course, decarbonization. Right? So to me, that is, a lot of people don't think of it that way because it seems like there are other more urgent things to do sometimes. Right? But this is now taking the #1 spot very quickly. So I think 22, 23, that is the #1 topic.
Do you think that will come from digitalization or things like new fuels, things like ammonia, whatever it would be? A matter of digitization for efficiency, for decarbonization, or moving to completely different fuels?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You know, technology will solve many of those problems. Yeah, but you can't run a huge ship on a Tesla type battery. You know, so there's a little different proportion there. So basically, technology will solve a lot of those practical problems, and by digitizing everything, there's going to be a tremendous savings and CO2 reduction. Right? But technology will not solve the societal, political, the business problem, right? Because when you incentivize to maximize profits and responsible for those profits, then when you change that, you change the model, right? So technology will do a big part of this, but the other part will be policy change by basically creating a more level playing field also that has the same rules, like the tax rules, same thing, right? And the hard part there is, of course, that nobody really likes the mingling, you know, of policy and all of those issues that we're dealing with every day. Right? But as I was saying earlier, COVID has taught us one thing: business as usual doesn't exist anymore. Right? It's basically like something happens and boom, it's different. And that is something that we have to learn.
The questions are now coming up behind you on the screen there. So no mention of recycling. Won't this have future impacts when linked to electric vehicles, etc.? Any comment on the recycling issue, batteries, etc.?
Yeah, it's hard to mention everything in a talk, but yes, of course. I mean, we've seen various efforts in the shipping industry to recycle and build new things from that, and that is obviously a very good direction to go in. I mean, we're seeing really amazing things. For example, the fact that the entire construction industry is rebuilding to use concrete that can be recycled. Right? And that concrete right now is like 3 or 4x of regular concrete. But the numbers are going to come down, and then it's basically that problem, one problem solved, right? And recycling is one of those things. So the circular economy, as it's been called, to take, replenish, give back, reuse, that is the new default. Having said that, I think the really tough part of it is how do you make that sort of the common sense among all of the players? And that is, again, a question of policy and strategy.
Another one there about the value of IP and IP rights and patents. So say if you get into the issue of collaboration, how do you balance that with intellectual property?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one. But I think, most of the industrial era society was built on extraction of a sort, And so we use those resources and we ship them around and we do things, and that creates benefits. And now you see the digital economy is about ideas. Like all of the big players are about data and social media, and it's about non-physical things. And there the IP is really important, but it's kind of fluid. It's like it's different than having a patent for a drill than having a patent for how people interact online or so, right? So it's an entirely different world, and it's much more short-fused also. So I think really collaboration beats the idea of holding on to your concept pretty much any day now, because it's a question of speed. I mean, how many times have you looked at companies who basically were doing innovation only in-house, right? And not bringing in others, and then other companies brought in people that were coming from the outside, like Mercedes-Benz and Audi and others are now doing, and it's like warp drive into a much faster development. So right now it's mostly about speed, and whoever gets big enough will have the IP. That's kind of what it has turned out to be. So of course not all IP is the same, right? But in reality, right now it's mostly about getting market share with new ideas and moving to sort of the creative level of the industry. And the other thing we shouldn't forget is ultimately that all business is about trust. And this is where, of course, what kind of brand you have and what you stand for comes in, right? People will give you business and do your shipping with those guys, not with those guys, because of trust, right? And because of relationship. And so that you can't forget those kind of things as well. They're still part of that too.
It's something actually we talk about in our own work, that the idea of collaboration in areas of mutual benefit and non-competition. One example we have is like the development of USB, which is a whole bunch of the technology companies came together because they're not competing on the type of port that's on the computer. They're competing on the type of services then that go behind that. So collaboration and IP can go hand in hand in those kind of...
Yeah, in many ways you can say the open source idea has kind of brought this concept into the mainstream, that you do things together and then other people build on top of it and they charge for that. Right? And it's a little bit hard to say how much of that will impact this industry right now, but it's quite simple. I mean, the technology has become so much more affordable and available than ever before. I mean, when I had my first internet startup in 1997, we spent $2 million building a website. Yeah? Just a functional website. And there was no Amazon cloud service. Today, it's like 2 hours and a bunch of APIs, and you have your website. So it's mind-boggling, all the things that we can do with so much less money.
The highest rated question there at the moment, then, what do you think is the likelihood of potential impacts of competing nations and potential conflicts in the next decade? Quite topical at the moment.
Yes. Well, I think given the overriding topics that we have right now, the concerns that are on top of mind, COVID, of course, right? Again, climate change, controlling technology, genetic engineering, right? It's quite clear that you cannot gain a whole lot of progress when you're focusing on one concern or on one country. Right? So I mean, you can see what's happening with China, how China is mutating into saying, okay, yeah, we are a big player, we're very strong, we have lots of money, but now they have to think more collaboratively. For example, the privacy laws that they just, which is kind of a strange thing for China. But anyway, long debate on this one. But I very much doubt that we're going to see large global conflicts on the military side. We're going to see a lot of money conflicts, and the idea of saying how do we pay for things that have to be done but nobody's willing to pay, and the difference between developing and developed countries. So basically, the current situation that we see with COVID and climate change is forcing us to collaborate or fail. And that's kind of the realization that we're going through right now.
What about internal conflicts? I mean, tribalism and different groups within society itself and within countries. It's a challenge that we're seeing in different countries now with vaccinations, with politics, etc.
Yeah, well, you get into a very basic question, which is the question of whether humans are basically good or bad. Because if you believe that they are good, then you would believe that we can figure this out. Yeah? Winston Churchill once said, you can always trust Americans to do the right thing after they tried everything else. Right? And so I would say that about humans, you can always trust humans to do the right thing after we try everything else. We are actually capable of collaboration. We are not evil, not in principle, but we can easily be sidetracked. Right? And so what you see now, all with the crisis, is people being sidetracked and going into silos, and social media has had a big role in this, right? And so it's really important to have a public space and democracy that's functioning. And right now, social media is undermining that, for example. Right? So in many ways, you could say we've traded the money for the good of democracy, because it makes lots of money, but it doesn't do any good. So it's a long story, but I'm much more convinced that we can solve these problems. Also because you've noticed in the COVID crisis that the performance of countries that weren't run well was abysmal. Right? And people in those countries, like Brazil, they're now saying, this wasn't a really good experience in the COVID. It didn't really work out too well in those years. And now we're going to have people who are more capable, making better decisions. The best example is, of course, Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand. And the leadership of course, it's New Zealand, right? But anyway, that's the best example of how that could possibly work, to have somebody that's a more holistic thinker. And we're seeing that in different countries in Europe now, like in the German election coming up. Big topic in Germany. What kind of paradigm do we have for the future? But I'm an optimist on this. I think we'll have lots of conflicts, but there's also new ways to solve things.
There's a question on financing there. I mean, you've mentioned the idea of throwing money at decarbonisation initiatives. In an industry like maritime that runs at very low margins, making long-term investments can be a challenge in getting the support for those. Where would you see the initial financing required for decarbonisation of this industry coming from in that kind of scenario?
Well, the money is there, it's just in the wrong place. It's like we put the money into this or into that, it changes everything. It's basically the decision that we make, for example, what the tax and where that tax goes, right? The carbon tax, for example. And that could be used, for example, to revolutionize airplane fuel and, of course, shipping fuel as well. But there's a lot of R&D and money has to be put into that. So the money is there, just has to be reallocated. It's an interesting scenario when you look at the last couple of years, is how the money has shifted to new places, but the underlying structure is still very much the same, right? Like you can see with the ESG investing and so on. So where the money comes from, yeah, that's a good question. I think the ultimate realization will be that we will need a way of redistributing money from different places and to raise more money in general, which translates to some sort of taxation of a sort. Yeah? Like in Germany, we had, when East Germany came back into the fold, we had a solidarity tax, was called in Germany, 6.2%, to bring the formerly GDR back into West Germany. Right? People hated it, of course, right? Extra money. But that money was used to create infrastructure and to create projects to actually make East Germany part of, again, and to rebuild something positively, and that has created a whole new development. Without that, it would have been much more costly and expensive. So we're going to see very similar things here.
Shipping need to do a better job of kind of pleading its case to be part of the public purse, I mean, to get some of that money for global decarbonisation.
I think a lot more money will be made available for that too. There'll be a lot of tough missions like penalties, so that if you don't pay them, you already come out ahead. But this is obviously an interesting story. Like, for example, for airlines, you have very much the same problem, right? It's technically pretty impossible to do what they're doing now without burning jet fuel. So there are lots and lots of models where you can think about how that could work, but it does entail a lot of wise policies, and they couldn't just be in one country. So it's a complicated story. But I do see it unfolding as, first of all, a sort of carbon tax scenario, which you can circumvent or sidestep in a way if you take action.
Okay, and I think as a final question as we come to the end of time, and actually the top one there is probably a good one with the overall themes of your presentation. What company is doing a good job today in the areas that you cite, digitization, decarbonization?
Company in your industry? I don't.
Anonymous.
That's hard to say. Yeah, it's hard to say. I think in general, for me, the car industry is a great example. How they turned around from being very sluggish and behind and waiting for Tesla and to do anything into a new engine of exactly this. Right? Painful though. Right? I mean, if you see Tesla has more market value than all of the 3 German car companies together. Right? But they're doing it now, and they learned their lesson. I think a lot of companies in this area of transport and mobility are kind of a blueprint for shipping, right? That we could look at and say maybe that same thing will happen here. But sadly, I think one of the realizations that we have every time we meet here is that the impetus to actually make bold steps hasn't really come until the last few years. It's also because, of course, the human nature is not to do anything if there's no pain or love, for that matter. Right? So you have to have a reason to change, and now you'll have plenty of reasons. Right? So that should be the preemptive strike, so to speak, to take action on this. As I said in the beginning, we're facing 10 years of considerable chaos, ups and downs, and uncertainty, and complexity, confusion. So the best thing you can do is to analyze all these things and talk to lots of people and then figure out the most intuitive response in every segment of the industry, which is not all the same. Right? I mean, to me, the case for ports is completely clear, right, on these topics. Ships, more of a challenge. Cruise ships, even more of a challenge. Right? So it's not the same across all of the pieces of the industry. Right? To me, the cruise ship model is fundamentally ending. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily not revivable, but in the current model, it's ending. It's funny, I had a discussion with the CEO of a car company in Munich, and we talked about exactly this. I said, guys like me who like your fancy cars, whatever top model, and would like to drive it, this model is ending, it's over, it's finished. Right? My kids are 35 years old, one doesn't have a license, the other one likes being driven by Uber. It's ending. So that is something we have to realize. And I think that's actually really quite different in each segment and in each country. It's important that there's no blueprint for this, except for the principles, 3 principles.
Ladies and gentlemen, could you put your hands together for Gerd Leonhard, please? Thank you very much.